The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Religion professor Damon Berry examines the history of white nationalism and its relationship to Christianity. Author Richard Rothstein has written a highly acclaimed book on the history of housing segregation in America, and he talks with us about how it resulted from government policy. And California Congressman Ted Lieu talks with Bill Press about DACA and other issues facing Congress this fall. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight, and follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Religion professor Damon Berry says mainstream Christians and the alt-right want nothing to do with each other. Love thy neighbor doesn't quite compute with white supremacists. And we say hello to Dr. Damon Berry, Assistant Professor of American Religions and Contemporary Issues in Religion at St. Lawrence University. Also the author of a new book called Blood and Faith, Christianity in American White Nationalism. Dr. Damon Berry, thanks so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, it is our pleasure to have you with us, of course. And, you know, your book examines the relationship of Christianity and the white power movement in America, and really globally. I assume mainstream Christian organizations want nothing to do with the extremists, though.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. The Southern Baptist Convention in June of this past year voted on a resolution denouncing the alt-right and other forms of white supremacy. And then, of course, Russell Moore of the Southern Baptist Convention has led that charge in many ways in the public media. But that vote was contentious. It wasn't a given that it was going to happen. There's a longer story behind it. And then Robert Lee IV, a descendant of Robert E. Lee, stated on MTV's Music Awards ceremony that, quote, "We have made my ancestor into an idol of white supremacy, racism, and hate. And as a pastor, it is my moral duty to speak out against racism, America's original sin," a statement which seems to have cost him his position at Bethany United Church of Christ. So, yeah, many people within mainstream denominations have spoken out against white supremacy and even made institutional efforts to root it out. But it seems to be an issue nonetheless, even if people don't necessarily in those organizations identify with the alt-right or white nationalists. So it's more than a yes or a no.
Yeah, right.
That makes sense? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me ask you this. How extensive is the upsurge in white nationalism that we see now through the lens of Charlottesville? And is it connected with the so-called alt-right political movement?
Absolutely. There's a very long answer to this question because the alternative right, or later the alt-right, actually emerges as a resurgence of what's called paleo-conservatism. So a conservatism that thinks that the modern conservative movement led by neoconservatives have taken things astray. And Paul Gottfried was the thinker. Now, he himself is Jewish, who began this alternative right movement in the early 2000s. And then later, it seems to have been co-opted by people like Richard Spencer. But elements of xenophobia were always there. So there's a connection there with folks like Richard Spencer taking on the alt-right. And then a man named Greg Johnson, who heads up the North American New Right, wrote an article for his online magazine basically stating that the alt-right is white nationalist, or it's nothing. So it's a long story, but yes, there are definite real connections to existing white nationalist trends and individuals and organizations to the alt-right. Now it pretty much is, I would say, a white nationalist organization, regardless of its origin. And that's part of the general, as your question suggests, upsurge in white nationalist organizing. We saw a definite spike in 2008 after the election of President Barack Obama. And a lot of that has been online activity. What we saw at Charlottesville was an effort to make that online activity more present in the streets. And people that attended basically said that that's what they were doing. But its online presence is now under assault, even as as Berkeley and Boston demonstrated, their ability to organize is being hampered. But I don't think that's a sign that they're going anywhere. I think they'll just try to re-strategize how they're going to go about doing what they're doing. So does that answer the question sufficiently?
Well, yeah, but, and it's pretty apparent, I think, that there are different strains of white nationalism operating loosely together. Are some of the groups actually at war with Christianity?
Well, there's a history to that. And now it seems to have changed. So the history was of white nationalists emerging, especially folks like Revello Oliver, who was a co-founder of the John Birch Society, wrote for National Review when it first started in the late 1950s, was one of these, arch, far-right conservatives that the Buckley movement tried to purge. Well, he ended up doing his own thing, and while he never started an organization, he helped lay the foundation, the intellectual foundation for contemporary white nationalism in the 1960s. And part of that foundation was moving away from both mainstream conservatives, as Buckley was defining it, and then also the Christianity that continues to be such an important part of the conservative movement. So he concluded, after some soul searching, it took him a few years to actually come out and say this under its own name, that Christianity was a problem for white racial survival. That, the doctrines of love thy neighbor and the way that it has been politically used by the conservative movement, it's abandoned any sense of racial preservation, something he felt that, and all white nationalists feel, should be the paramount political priority. Now, there's a long history, and that's what the book is about, of these similar reactions from different people, some of them who would regard themselves as atheists, others who would start new religious movements, and others still who would regard themselves as neo-pagan in a way, and have their objections to Christianity. More recently, again, led by people like Greg Johnson, there's an effort to minimize that friction for the common political goal of establishing a white ethno-state here in America.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Dr. Damon. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so now the religious tensions that have been long part of white nationalism since the 1960s are now being smoothed over, and they're developing more of a religious tolerance. And the attitude is that white Christians will get on board eventually once the political goals are achieved.
We're speaking with Dr. Damon Berry, Assistant Professor of American Religions and Contemporary Issues in Religion at St. Lawrence University, also the author of a new book, Blood and Faith, Christianity in American White Nationalism. Damon, why has white nationalism grown so much lately? Or is it possible it hasn't really grown, but is just more out in the open, we're talking about it and seeing it more?
Yeah, I think maybe it's a little bit of both. I mean, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, because a lot of the people that participate, even if they regard themselves as common members of a group or a movement, they don't often interact apart from the internet. So that it's very diffuse, more or less leaderless. So it doesn't work like, say, the Klan during the Civil Rights Movement. It doesn't work like that. But what we can say is that, I mean, at least what I see is a growing, or rather a shrinking gap in mainstream political discourse about anti-immigration, anti-multiculturalism, about reactions to so-called political correctness, a shrinking gap between that discourse, especially among young white men, and what white nationalists say all the time. So what has been a part of their repertoire of language is now also the same language that one might hear at in other circles, like at the CPAC, for example, the large conservative political organizations. As a matter of fact, self-professed and well-known white nationalists have been at CPAC, including Richard Spencer himself. He was there not just when he was removed for fear he would cause a disturbance and then denounce, but he was there prior to that as well. So I think in part we're seeing a growth in white nationalist movements because of the shrinking gap in the way that mainstream conservative discourse works about issues like immigration and multiculturalism and English only. Very important issue for white nationalists, but also more recently a political issue for rethinking immigration law itself. So I think all that comes together, and of course the internet has been absolutely essential for growing their numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what is the reason, if any, for the historical connection among racist nationalists and Christian fundamentalists?
Well, Randall Balmer, a historian of evangelicalism, has argued that the rise of the religious right wasn't just about abortion, but rather it was maybe predominantly about desegregation, right? So when we look at Christian fundamentalism, not as a pejorative, but as an actual movement, it was always majority white. It was always predominantly South or Middle South. And it was, they created their own institutions. Christian fundamentalists created their own institutions, and many of these institutions were racially segregated, in part because just de facto, majority white community creating their own educational institutions. But also de jure in parts where Jim Crow was the rule. So these private Christian schools were segregated, and desegregation threatened that. And Randall Balmer argues, convincingly, I think, that fighting desegregation was a part of what gave surge to the religious right, that also, of course, addressed abortion and other social issues. And still today, as we can just look in the news and see how contentious President Trump's evangelical supporters have been on issues like immigration. Now, the DACA repeal, the suggested delayed DACA repeal, has caused many of his staunchest evangelical supporters to question whether or not this is appropriate. But these are also people who still supported the wall and many other issues that maybe white nationalists would also find important as well. So in many ways, the relationship is one of not necessarily one belonging to the other, but rather their historical closeness or distance on certain issues.
Is there a typical worldview of white nationalism? And how would someone rationalize racism, anti-Semitism, and authoritarianism?
Yeah, well, I think that, well, at least I argue that the overarching ideology that helps us make sense of how Christianity specifically is a problem for white nationalists who are organizing to try to do other things is called racial protectionism, or at least that's what I call it. And this is the idea that what is most important is the protection and preservation of the future of the white race. Along with that comes, of course, historical connections to state-centered fascisms. But after their defeat, this became an attitude that was more diffuse, more pan-European, and a person who led that charge was an American named Francis Parker Yockey, who wrote a book called Imperium under a pseudonym. But he argues that Europe and European peoples are sandwiched between the communists and what he called the Washington regime, and there's an element of anti-Semitism in there as well. But he argued that true Americans and true Europeans were going to have to make a decision for their own future cultural and biological survival. And that notion has persisted throughout American white nationalism. It's become the central organizing principle. Even though white nationalists might disagree on how they might accomplish that goal, that's what they're after. And religion plays an important part because it's such an important part of, especially in the United States, thinking about political ideology, especially if one is either arguing why we shouldn't be conservatives or why white nationalists shouldn't be conservatives and a part of the conservative movement, or arguing how they're going to get back in to transform, because this is what the alt-right wants to do, transform the Republican Party into a populist white party. And that sort of thing comes with racism and anti-Semitism because those ideas are inherently racist and anti-Semitic, right? Jews and others are regarded as people who are wholly other, and their very presence threatens the survival of the white race. So and that's why many of them call themselves white separatists. So.
Well, I have a feeling we're going to be talking about this a lot more in the future. Dr. Damon Berry, Assistant Professor of American Religions and Contemporary Issues in Religion at St. Louis University. He's the author of the new book called Blood and Faith, Christianity in American White Nationalism. Dr. Damon Berry, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We do look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you, sir.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Author Richard Rothstein reveals the long, sordid history of government policies that led to and maintained segregated housing, where violent opposition to fair housing was supported by police and prosecutors. More on that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Want good quality, lower cost health care for your family? And what the hell, let's think big here. For every man, woman, and especially every child in our society, here's how we can finally get Congress to pass such a program. Step 1. Take away every dime of the multi-million-dollar government subsidy that members of Congress get to cover their platinum-level health insurance. Let them have to live with the same exorbitantly expensive, dysfunctional, and, let's admit it, sick system of medical profiteering they thrust upon us. Eliminate all of their special treatments, including shutting down their Office of the Attending Physician, a little-known spot of pure 100% socialized medicine, conveniently located in our U.S. Capitol to provide government-paid doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and others who give immediate, on-the-spot attention to these special ones. Well, you might say, they still won't feel the pain because they're 1%ers, pulling down $174,000 each from us taxpayers, meaning they can afford to buy decent health insurance. But here comes step 2. Put all of our congressional goof-offs on pay-for-performance salaries. Why pay them a flat rate whether they produce or not? For example, American babies are 1/3 more likely to die in their first year of life than babies in Poland, which provides universal health insurance for all of its people. So every year that the U.S. Congress fails to provide health coverage for every American family, the members should get their pay docked by 1/3. Pay them only when they deliver for the people. This is Jim Hightower saying, when Congress finally assures good health care for all of us, then its members would get the same coverage. But until they deliver for the whole public, the public owes them absolutely nothing.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Richard Rothstein has written a powerful new book, The Color of Law, about how deliberate policies of local, state, and federal governments conspired to maintain racial discrimination in housing. And we say hello to Richard Rothstein, who's a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute, and he's author of The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. Richard Rothstein, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you.
Now, on the question of segregated neighborhoods, is it normal for people to want to live among others with whom they share a common history and culture?
Well, some people will always prefer that, and others will prefer to live in more integrated neighborhoods. And that's been the pattern with many groups in this country. Jews, Italians, Irish. We find many communities that have larger percentages of each of those groups than they are represented in the overall population. But we have very few communities where groups like that are so predominant as African Americans are in segregated neighborhoods and urban areas. There's a long history of African Americans demonstrating that they prefer integration. Many do. They frequently were met with violence when they attempted to move into integrated neighborhoods, and that violence was also frequently supported and encouraged by local police forces and even prosecutors. There's the notion that African Americans simply prefer to live with others of the same race is belied by the hundreds and hundreds of incidences where African Americans throughout the 20th century attempted to move into predominantly white communities and were driven out either by prosecutors or by police forces or by mobs that were encouraged by police officers. So it's certainly the case that a fully integrated nation would not have precise identical percentages of every racial and ethnic group in every neighborhood. There would certainly be concentrations, but the excessive segregation of African Americans in every metropolitan area in this country cannot be explained by personal preference.
Mm-hmm. And it's obviously something that we have created over time, and especially, I guess, back in the early 20th century. And related to that question, is it at all understandable that non-African Americans look at crime rates, drug use, and unemployment among blacks with concern for their own neighborhoods?
Well, let me go back for a minute with your question. It was the mid-20th century that these policies were primarily practiced by the federal government to segregate metropolitan areas. There were two main policies that were done in the mid-20th century to segregate metropolitan areas. One was the public housing program, which was not originally a program for poor people. It was a program for middle-class people created during the Depression and during World War II and after, because we had housing shortages in the mid-20th century at that time. And the federal government built segregated housing, in many cases demolishing integrated neighborhoods and replacing it with segregated public housing, creating segregation in cities that had never before known it. And the other major program that the federal government followed was a program of the Federal Housing Administration to subsidize the suburbanization of the country by subsidizing builders to create mass production suburbs with the explicit requirement that African Americans be excluded. Well, those two programs resulted in the concentration of African Americans in urban areas, overcrowded, dense, and when you concentrate people in overcrowded neighborhoods with fewer city services, they turn into slums. And the conditions that arise, whether it's crime or deteriorated housing, garbage in the streets from lack of public services, create slums. But those slums were created by public policy. Had African Americans been permitted to move as whites were, they were all urban dwellers before, but had African Americans been permitted to move into suburbs as whites were and subsidized to do so, they would not have lived in slum conditions, and they would not have been seen as slum dwellers by white families. So white families did see the slums. They saw African Americans living in them. They concluded that the slum conditions were characteristics of the people rather than the direct result of federal policy designed to concentrate African Americans in very dense, overcrowded neighborhoods with less adequate city services than whites were receiving.
Now, with the issue of housing segregation, is it tied deeply to other issues as well? Unemployment, single motherhood, lending practices? Some of this within your control, some not, perhaps?
Well, it's tied into many programs, many other issues, like you described. African Americans were typically concentrated in urban areas in the mid-20th century, at the same time that industry was leaving those areas, and so employment opportunities disappeared. The population of urban African American neighborhoods became poorer and poorer because of the flight of jobs. That's one direct result of segregation. Of course, once you have large-scale unemployment, marriage rates decline because one of the characteristics of marriage is it's an economic union as well as a romantic one. And women are understandably reluctant to marry men who can't help support their families. This is also, therefore, a partial result of segregation. I'm certainly not claiming it's the only segregation is the only cause. When you concentrate low-income families in neighborhoods without opportunity, young men become despondent. They become aggressive and engage in oppositional behavior, and crime increases. Police respond by treating the area as a colonial assignment where their role is to keep the population under control, and so you get the kinds of conflicts that we've seen in the last few years in Ferguson and Baltimore and elsewhere. So all of these are partly the result of federal policy that was explicitly designed to segregate the nation. And it's policy that was not in the South. It was in the North, the Midwest, the West as well. The suburbs that we're very familiar with, like Levittown or Lakewood south of Los Angeles, or any of the hundreds of them in between, were all created as racially exclusive suburbs by the federal government. And we're paying the price for that today in many of these social problems that you mentioned.
We're speaking with Richard Rothstein, Research Associate of the Economic Policy Institute and author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Richard, are there some, if not simple, at least doable solutions to desegregating residential housing that can be accomplished with right-wing legislatures, houses of Congress, and courts holding power?
Well, no. Of course, you're answering your question in the way you pose it. Can reforms be accomplished when the people in power are opposed to reform? The answer is obviously no. But even with more progressive public officials, we would not be taking the proper steps now because we're operating under a myth that's shared by conservatives and liberals alike. And that's the myth that we have de facto segregation in every metropolitan area. That it all happened by accident because of private prejudice, personal choices, discrimination perhaps by real estate agents and banks, or income differences. So long as we have that myth, and it's shared across the political spectrum, the myth of de facto segregation, we're not going to have the kinds of national conversations, no matter who's in power, that are necessary to craft the solutions to remedy these unconstitutional policies that created segregated neighborhoods. So the first task we have to undertake is not trying to conceive of legislative solutions, but the first task is to create a new consensus around the understanding of the history of how this all happened. Because if we understood that the residential distributions of the races in every metropolitan area in this country was unconstitutionally created by racially explicit government policy, then we would understand that we have an obligation to remedy it. And once we understand we have an obligation to remedy it, then we can do a much better job of coming up with the kinds of solutions that are necessary.
Now, we have liberals like FDR and Harry Truman that promoted, or at least condoned, segregation in housing and elsewhere. Was that bigotry or political necessity? And can we hold leaders of yesterday to standards of today?
Well, it was not bigotry as such. It was an assumption. It was a shared assumption I guess you could call it bigotry, of the superiority of whites that was shared by the ruling elites of this country in the New Deal and Fair Deal. But there were always voices in opposition. So it's a mistake to think that these were standards of yesterday compared to standards of today. Had leaders of yesterday in the New Deal and Fair Deal wanted to, they had lots of models of different ideas that they could have adapted. They knew it was wrong. I think particularly, for example, of the University of Chicago, the president of the University of Chicago, who in the office of the presidency throughout the mid-20th century, his name was Robert Hutchins, maintained an office that was designed to prosecute African Americans who moved into the neighborhoods around the University of Chicago and have them evicted. And Robert Hutchins later admitted that he knew it was wrong. He knew it was the worst mistake he said he had made, but he didn't have the courage to do the right thing. But it's not that he didn't have standards that he could have adapted. During the Roosevelt administration, the president's wife was a more aggressive advocate of integration, but he chose not to listen. You can say it was for political reasons, but we have a constitution that's designed to prohibit people from doing politically safe things when it violates the rights of minorities. So that can't be an excuse. It would be one thing if nobody had a different view, but there were plenty of voices out there that knew that these policies were wrong, that argued against them, but that were not listened to.
Okay. Richard Rothstein, Research Associate of the Economic Policy Institute and author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Richard, we do appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org and look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with progressive California Congressman Ted Lieu.
So, Congressman, I was stunned last week. I learned something from Speaker Paul Ryan, because I've heard so many Democratic members of Congress, including you, sir, have come in and bemoaned the fact that you come back to Washington to get a lot of things done, and doesn't seem to be a lot of things getting done. That's not the way Paul Ryan puts it. Here's the Speaker last week.
We've actually passed more bills in the House for the president and his agenda in this first 6 months of his administration than in the first 6 months of Obama, Clinton, and both Bushes. The House has passed 316 bills. That's a record pace. Now, 260 of them are still in the Senate. The Senate's busy working on judges and appointees and the rest. But the House has been extremely productive. Not just extremely productive. The House has been more productive than any Congress in the modern era.
The most productive Congress in the modern era, Congressman.
Okay. That's one of the most ridiculous statements I've heard in quite a while. And the Speaker doesn't seem to understand that the goal of what we're doing is not to pass a lot of bills that gets ignored by the Senate and the White House. The goal is actually to pass laws that help the American people. And so what ends up happening is Speaker Ryan set up this bizarre metric where he just measures based on how much extreme bills can you lob over to the Senate. Yeah. And then they don't get acted upon. So it's really a waste of taxpayer resources, a waste of the time of members of Congress. But yes, we pass a whole bunch of bills to the Senate that will be completely ignored. And so that's what's happening.
What would you say of significance that the House has accomplished this year?
So what's ironic is perhaps the most significant legislative accomplishment in the first 6 months was a Russia sanctions bill that President Trump opposed and he was forced to sign. So that was really the major accomplishment of Congress in the first 6 months.
Would you agree with what some members have told me, that a second significant accomplishment could be a Dreamers Act if it came to the floor of the House?
Absolutely. And you have both Republicans now as well as Democrats saying that children who are brought here should not be punished and sent back to a country they have never known. You have 69% of Trump supporters in a recent poll supporting Dreamers and DACA. And I think there is momentum to get the DREAM Act put in legislatively.
So Democrats would support, and enough Republicans would support, right?
We'll see if there's enough Republicans, but every day we get more, and we're gaining momentum.
Is Paul Ryan inclined to put that bill on the floor?
He told Donald Trump to not get rid of the DACA program. So if Paul Ryan were to follow through on his principles, he would allow a vote on the Dreamers bill.
He would allow a vote, yeah.
If he followed his principles. Because before Donald Trump eliminated the DACA program, he told Donald Trump, do not do that.
Not to get rid of it, yeah.
The broader suggestion that I hear from some fairly moderate or centrist Republicans is the idea of tying DACA to some kind of increased so-called border enforcement or border security enforcement, some increased measures there. Is that something that Democrats would countenance at all, even if it wasn't the border, the infamous border wall?
So I believe what we need is comprehensive immigration reform. And the problem with DACA is a symptom of not having comprehensive immigration reform.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, I don't have a philosophical objection to having increased border security. I will oppose a wall. That's just stupid. It is inefficient, and it's a waste of taxpayer resources. But if you want to have increased border security through other means, I think that's something that I would look at, and I believe other Democrats would look at.
Mm-hmm. But a standalone Dreamers bill, I guess, would be the best option from your point of view, correct?
Absolutely. And I think there's momentum to do that, and we'll see if Speaker Ryan is true to his principles and puts it on the floor for a vote.
And then deal with some of the other issues in the comprehensive bill. I've heard that there is a discharge position circulating in the House. Are you aware of that, and is it making any progress?
I am. So the discharge petition is this process where you can force a vote on the floor of the House if you have 218 people sign it. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is you basically have members of Congress go to the floor of the House and put their signature down saying, we want to discharge this bill, so it moves out of committee onto the floor.
It's sort of a way of overriding the Speaker, correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it has been done before. We did it in order to reauthorize the Export-Import Bank. So there is precedence for doing this.
And is it what's the progress on DACA?
We'll know later this month.
Okay.
Yeah.
But Republicans, or at least some Republicans, are feeling the political pressure on DACA, in your opinion.
Absolutely. You have Republicans in the Senate that are co-authoring bills to put in DACA legislatively. You've had a number of Republicans in the House also make statements that they believe DACA should be preserved.
I have to ask: Are you a physician? Do I remember that?
No, but my doctor, my brother, my brother is a doctor.
Oh, okay,
yeah,
all right.
And my parents remind me of that.
Not that it matters, but in terms of my question, I wanted to ask you because today is a significant day in the Senate, where Senator Bernie Sanders is introducing his bill, Medicare for All, with the support of 15 Democratic senators, where Bernie, in the past, has always been the lonely only on that bill. And John Conyers in the House has more people signed up on his Medicare for All bill than ever in the past. Where do you stand on Medicare for All? Is this the answer?
Yes. I'm a co-author of the John Conyers bill. When I was in the California state legislature, I co-authored every single payer bill. I believe that's what we need to do. I'm very pleased that we have more and more Democrats coming to that conclusion. And in the state of California, there's also a single-payer bill, and I urge the California State Assembly to pass it.
What are the advantages for the American people of single-payer or Medicare for All?
Sure. It's vastly more efficient, right? So health insurance companies, what they basically do, how they make money, is they take premiums from consumers and then they try not to give out a lot of medical care. It's just the way they're designed. And that is costing a lot of money. So if you had single payer, it would eliminate that entire process, and it's a much more efficient system, and everybody gets covered.
Bernie Sanders has an op-ed in the New York Times this morning where he points out that the United States spends an average of $10,000 per person on Medicaid, health care, and there are still 28 million Americans who are not covered. Whereas in the UK and in France and Britain and Canada, they spend about half of that, and everybody's covered. To me, that makes a pretty argument.
There's no real argument that we have a vastly inefficient medical system in the United States.
And costly.
But is it, just to Bill's point, because as he alluded from my accent, I'm not born in this country, the argument for universal health care was won in the United Kingdom 60 to 70 years ago, admittedly over opposition at the time, but it was won. But that means that in this country there has been 60 or 70 years of people who profit from the existing system strengthening their position or digging in. So just how relentless or how intense is the opposition that one has to overcome in order to enact something like Medicare?
It's extremely intense, and that's a very good point. You have vested stakeholders with a lot of money that they can spend in our political system. And unlike the UK, America has this problem with campaign finance, where vast amounts of political money flood our elections, especially after a Citizens United decision. And that does make things harder in the U.S., whether it's healthcare or climate change or other issues. Money does pervert democracy.
Should Medicare for all be a litmus test for Democrats in 2018?
I don't think we should have litmus tests. I think what we need to do is take back the House and take back the Senate. And at the end of the day, each member of Congress has to represent their district. And my district, which has beautiful Malibu and Santa Monica, it's not going to be the same as someone's district in Minnesota, for example. And I think different members need to represent their constituents the best way that they can.
And so that there, in fact, among the leadership today, there are some, among Democrats, some various approaches. Yesterday, Leader Pelosi said, I think we ought to be focusing on making sure that Obamacare is not destroyed by the Trump administration. That ought to be our first priority. On the Senate side, Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio and Debbie Stabenow from Michigan have said, well, we like this Medicare for all, but let's take one step first, which is Medicare for everybody 55 or older can buy into Medicare. So I guess we're saying these are all variations on a theme that are all sort of okay for Democrats.
Well, Leader Pelosi is correct. If Obamacare get destroyed, that's actually a step backwards from getting to Medicare for all. So at the very least, we need to preserve the Affordable Care Act, and then we build upon that and get to Medicare for all. So I should go back to one of your first questions when you mentioned Speaker Ryan and accomplishments. One of the biggest accomplishments is having the House and Senate not repeal Obamacare in the first 6 months.
Right.
And so you can also look at negative things,
I was going to say
that didn't happen.
That was a negative accomplishment. So you do represent such a great district, and a district that I lived in and love, that part of the world. But generally, among the American people, to Niall's point, is the support growing for single payer?
Oh, absolutely. Every year that passes, more and more people support single payer because they realize how inefficient and costly the system is. And while the Affordable Care Act was amazing in bringing in more people who are insured, like every other type of healthcare reform, it has not capped costs, and costs keep rising, although more slowly than they would have without the Affordable Care Act, but it does still rise. And so I think eventually we're going to have to shift to Medicare for all because it's the only viable model that can help insure everyone in America.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about a little breaking news item from CNN this morning. I just got on my phone. From CNN on the Russian investigation. Democrats send the special counsel a letter saying that former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn failed to disclose a trip to broker a Saudi-Russian business deal. Whatever we know about that, what does this tell you about the Russian investigation? It's not going away, is it?
It is not. I'm on the Foreign Affairs Committee. That letter was from Ranking Member Engo on the Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as Ranking Member Cummings of the Oversight Committee. And it shows, again, that you had a lot of lying by Trump officials. So Michael Flynn fails to disclose on his security clearance form this trip and his contacts with these foreign nationals. I filled out these security clearance forms before. They're known as SF-15s. And I just looked at the last one I filled out. Over a third of it had to deal with your contacts with foreign nationals and foreign trips. You can't finish that form and not think, foreign national contacts are really important to the United States government. So when you don't disclose that, it's intentional. And when you certify it, it actually says if you omit material information, that is a felony. So Michael Flynn is in deep, deep trouble. And by the way, Jared Kushner did the same thing twice. He had to submit 3 security clearance forms to finally get it right. Michael Flynn's been fired. I don't know why Jared Kushner still has a security clearance. I don't know why he still has a job.
Wow. I'm surprised that you knew this much about this letter. I didn't realize where the letter came from. I had just seen the headline. But it does mean that this Russian investigation, it's not just a witch hunt, right? I mean, this is a serious investigation with serious consequences.
Absolutely. And the reason you don't know, that's not a witch hunt is you can look at the actions of the special counsel. So Special Counsel Mueller comes in, he looks at the evidence, and what's the first thing he does? He doesn't sort of say, hey, I need more investigators to sort of figure out what's going on. He hires a bunch of prosecutors, and you hire prosecutors to prosecute. Mm-hmm. And the folks he hires are folks who are experts in criminal law, in foreign corruption, in bribery, and money laundering. He then convenes a grand jury. That's the one step before indictment. So you can tell from his actions that he clearly sees there's evidence there of crimes.
Right. Is the House Intelligence Committee still on the case?
They are, although it's not clear what Devin Nunes' role is. He's supposed to have recused himself, and then you see him signing things, dealing with the Russian investigation, so it's not clear what he's doing. I personally think that he intentionally misled the American people, and he really should not be on that committee at all.
Despite the best efforts of Adam Schiff to keep that on track and to keep them going. I mean, between Nunes and whoever took his place, I forget, or in the Russian side of it, I mean, they seem to be doing everything they can to impede that investigation.
Adam is doing a great job.
Yeah.
But he has to deal with some of his Republican colleagues that really are off the reservation.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Damon Berry, Richard Rothstein, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.